Welcome to Woven in True Crime, where we unravel the complex webs behind the most terrifying stories. Today, we explore a case many think they know, John Wayne Gacy, the killer clown. But instead of recounting the sordid details you've heard countless times, we dive into a perspective you've never seen before. We go beyond the crimes themselves and examine the society that allowed Gacy to go unnoticed for years, his cunning manipulations, the power dynamics he mastered, and the collective failure that enabled his atrocities. Stay with us as we profile this killer uniquely, revealing how the shadows of trust and charisma can conceal a true nightmare. John Wayne Gacy, the killer clown and his legacy of horror. On March 17, 1942, in Chicago, Illinois, John Wayne Gacy was born. His name paid tribute to the legendary Hollywood star known for his heroic roles in Western films. However, the John Wayne born in Chicago would take a dark and disturbing path, becoming one of the most notorious serial killers in the United States. Although he maintained a public image as an exemplary citizen and active community worker for a long time, the killer clown, as he became known, hid a life of brutality and violence. Over 6 years, he murdered 33 young men, burying most of them in the basement of his own house. Gacy's story exemplifies the extreme duality of human nature. This text examines John Wayne Gacy's life, his motivations, actions, and the impact of his crimes on society. It illustrates how an apparently ordinary individual managed to hide a dark and violent side for years, despite being an active community member respected by many around him. Childhood and adolescence, the beginning of a nightmare. John Wayne Gacy's childhood was marked by a troubled family environment. The son of a loving but submissive mother and a violent, authoritarian father, Gacy grew up amid constant conflicts. His father frequently insulted and physically abused him, often calling him weak and a sissy. The abusive relationship with his father had a profound effect on Gacy, who, like many victims of abuse, carried trauma that would impact his adult life. From a young age, Gacy showed signs of emotional disturbances and difficulties in dealing with his sexual identity. In an era when homosexuality was heavily condemned, Gacy faced an internal battle, without support or understanding. His few relationships were turbulent and inconsistent. Additionally, he was sexually abused by a family friend, but he never shared this experience with anyone, fearing further reprisals from his father. In adolescence, Gacy developed a desire for recognition and social acceptance. This desire intensified as he tried to impress his father but never obtained the approval he sought. Nevertheless, he became known as a sociable and hardworking young man who could easily make friends. This social ability would later help him mask his malicious intentions and deceive both his victims and the community. Adult life and social ascent. In the 1960s, Gacy married for the first time, trying to fit into society's traditional standards. He had 2 children with his first wife, and his father-in-law gave him the opportunity to manage a fast food franchise. This not only gave him financial stability but also a facade of respectability that would help conceal his double life. He was an active member of the community, involved in groups like the local Democratic Party and charitable organizations. He often organized social events and children's parties, where he dressed up as Pogo the Clown, a character he created himself. This image of a family man and community figure was essential in maintaining his secret activities. No one suspected that behind the clown mask and smiling figure was a cold, calculating killer. However, Gacy soon showed violent tendencies. In 1968, he was accused of sodomy and sexual abuse of a teenage boy. As a result, he was sentenced to 10 years in prison. However, due to good behavior, he was released after only 18 months. His wife filed for divorce, and he lost contact with his children. From then on, Gacy's life took an even darker turn. After his release, he moved to a house in Norwood Park, an area near Chicago. It was in this house, where he lived alone for some time and later married for a second time, that he would begin his series of murders. The persona of Pogo the Clown. In the early 1970s, Gacy became more deeply involved in social activities. He joined a group of amateur clowns who visited hospitals and performed for underprivileged children. He created the character, Pogo the Clown, with a painted face and colorful clothes, becoming known in the region for his charity acts. The contrast between what Gacy showed the public and what he did in secret is one of the most frightening characteristics of his personality. In public, Gacy was friendly, affable, and often generous. To those who knew him, he appeared to be a respectable businessman who cared about the community's well-being. His parties and charity events drew attention from many people, including politicians and important figures. This Good Samaritan image created a shield of impunity that allowed him to continue his crimes without arousing suspicion. The escalation of crimes, how Gacy became a serial killer. Between 1972 and 1978, John Wayne Gacy lured dozens of young men to his house. Most were boys aged 14 to 21, many of them runaways or looking for work. Gacy offered temporary jobs in his construction company, which he used as a front to attract his victims. Once at Gacy's house, the boys were coerced into participating in games that involved handcuffs and magic tricks. He convinced his victims to wear handcuffs as part of a trick, but once they were restrained, he began torturing them. Gacy had a specific pattern for his murders, known as his modus operandi. He tied the victims' hands and feet, then physically and psychologically tortured them. He also raped most of his victims before killing them by asphyxiation, using a method that involved slowly tightening a rope until the victim died. In some cases, he prolonged the torture for hours or even days, controlling the oxygen levels so the victims lost consciousness and then regained it. This prolongation of suffering seemed to bring him satisfaction. Gacy buried most of his victims in the basement of his house. In some cases, he poured lime over the bodies to try to delay the decomposition process. As the bodies accumulated, he improvised additional burial sites in other areas of the property, and in some cases, disposed of bodies in the river. The fall of John Wayne Gacy. John Wayne Gacy's reign of terror lasted years, but in 1978 he made a fatal mistake. His last known victim, Robert Piest, a 15-year-old boy, was last seen leaving a convenience store, where he told a friend he was going to speak with Gacy about a job opportunity. When the boy did not return home, Piest's family contacted the police, who began investigating Gacy. Authorities initially considered Gacy a suspect due to his criminal record. After days of surveillance, the police obtained a search warrant for his house. In the basement, investigators found items belonging to several missing victims. Upon inspecting the space beneath the floor, they discovered evidence of buried bodies. The search revealed a shocking total of 29 decomposing bodies, all victims of Gacy. He eventually confessed to killing 33 young men and provided graphic details about his methods of torture and murder. The trial and conviction. John Wayne Gacy was brought to trial in 1980. He attempted to plead insanity, claiming multiple personalities and asserting he had no control over his actions. However, the court, supported by criminal psychology experts, concluded that Gacy was fully aware of his actions and had meticulously planned each murder. He was found guilty and sentenced to death. Gacy spent the next 14 years on death row, during which he made numerous appeals to avoid execution. During this time, he devoted himself to painting, producing several works of art, many depicting his alter ego, Pogo the Clown. These paintings were sold at auctions and are still seen as controversial items, primarily acquired by collectors interested in macabre art. On May 10, 1994, John Wayne Gacy was executed by lethal injection. The execution process was not without controversy, as a technical complication prolonged his death by about 18 minutes. This detail provoked mixed reactions from the public. Some human rights advocates argued that the execution was inhumane, while victims' families and others said that Gacy suffered far less than his victims did at his hands. The case prosecutor even remarked coldly that Gacy's 18 minutes of agony were incomparable to the horrors he inflicted on his victims, thus closing one of the darkest criminal stories in the United States. The psychology behind the killer clown. John Wayne Gacy has become one of the main examples of psychopathy in criminology studies. His case is analyzed as an example of how a psychopath can create such an effective social facade that it deceives even those close to him. Psychopathy, unlike schizophrenia or multiple personality disorders, is characterized by a lack of empathy, emotional coldness, and a sense of grandiosity. Gacy displayed all these traits, combined with a superficial charm that allowed him to gain the trust of victims and the community. Gacy's modus operandi, using magic tricks and games to lure his victims, reflects his manipulative skill. He knew how to act calculatedly so people would trust him, part of his strategy to hide his violent intentions. This manipulation even extended to the police, whom he once offered to help in investigations into disappearances where he was the culprit. Experts point out that, while many serial killers have a victim pattern reflecting specific traumas, Gacy chose young boys not necessarily with a specific physical type but representing an opportunity. His victims were largely teenagers facing family challenges or in vulnerable situations, such as runaways or those looking for work. This indicates that Gacy was a predator who exploited the weaknesses and social invisibility of his prey. The impact and legacy of the crimes. The discovery of John Wayne Gacy's crimes left a profound mark on American society and changed the way serial killer cases were investigated. Until then, it was difficult to imagine that someone so engaged in community activities and so socially respected could be such a brutal killer. The Gacy case contributed to changes in background check procedures and improved cooperation between police departments across different states, a significant shortcoming at the time of his crimes. The media coverage of Gacy's crimes and trial also ushered in a new era of true crime reporting. Documentaries, books, and articles were published, not only detailing the crimes but also discussing Gacy's psychological profile and what drove a man to commit such violence. Television programs like Mindhunter and films about serial killers often draw inspiration from cases like Gacy's to explore the mind of criminals and the police's efforts to understand them. The impact on the victims' families was devastating. Many parents and relatives spent years not knowing the fate of their sons, and when they finally learned, the pain was compounded by the horrendous circumstances of their deaths. Gacy's execution brought some relief to these families but never fully erased the pain of their loss. The symbolism of the clown in popular culture. The figure of the clown, once a symbol of fun and innocence, gained a new meaning after the exposure of Gacy's crimes. Although Gacy did not commit murders dressed as a clown, the association between him and his sinister alter ego Pogo influenced how clowns are depicted in popular culture. The killer clown became an archetype, inspiring characters in horror literature and films. A notable example is Pennywise from Stephen King's It, published in 1986. Just 2 years after Gacy's conviction. Pennywise embodies the dual nature of being both alluring and terrifying, characteristics that Gacy exemplified in real life. Movies and series exploring psychopathic themes often reference Gacy as a case study for the complexity of the criminal mind. Reflections on safety and legislation. Gacy's crimes also raised questions about the deficiencies in public safety systems and the protection of children and adolescents. During his crime spree, there was minimal communication between police departments, allowing a person with a criminal record of sexual abuse to move to another area and continue committing crimes undetected. Following Gacy's arrest and the discovery of his victims, laws were reviewed and improved to make it harder for sexual predators to hide in society. Awareness programs about the dangers of predators were implemented in schools and communities. Collaboration between different levels of law enforcement was also strengthened, with the FBI and other federal agencies developing better practices for identifying patterns in serial crimes. This led to more detailed criminal profiling and the enhancement of offender monitoring systems. The enduring significance of the John Wayne Gacy case. John Wayne Gacy was not only one of the deadliest serial killers in American history but also a shocking example of how someone could lead a double life for years without raising significant suspicion. He exploited loopholes in the system and the trust of society to commit his crimes. The Gacy case serves as a dark reminder that appearances can be deceiving and that the true face of evil may be hidden behind a friendly mask. Even decades after his execution, Gacy's legacy continues to haunt collective memory. His case is studied in criminology courses, inspires characters in works of fiction, and serves as a constant warning about the importance of vigilance and healthy skepticism. The killer clown represents the embodiment of terror that can exist disguised in broad daylight, a monster who managed to elude society and commit unimaginable horrors until he was finally unmasked.